When my son Carter called to tell me about his wedding date, I could hear his fiancée Brooke whispering in the background. And that's when I knew something was terribly wrong, because her words were crystal clear. Even though she thought I couldn't hear them, she said, "Tell her she's not invited. We only want special people there." And my whole world shattered in that single moment, like a wine glass hitting marble floor, sending shards everywhere that you'll never fully clean up. The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hand, as Carter cleared his throat and said, "Mom, the wedding is going to be really small, just immediate family." And I wanted to scream that I am immediate family. I'm your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you alone after your father died when you were 7. I sold my jewelry to pay for your college, but instead, I just stood there in my kitchen watching the coffee. I'd been making overflow from the pot because I'd forgotten I was holding it. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. The silence stretched between us on that phone call, and I could taste copper in my mouth from biting my tongue so hard, trying not to cry or beg or remind him of everything I'd done for him and Brooke over the past 3 years since they'd been together. 3 years of paying their rent when Carter lost his job. 3 years of buying their groceries when things got tight. 3 years of pretending not to notice when Brooke rolled her eyes every time I visited, or how she'd suddenly get migraines whenever I invited them for Sunday dinner. "Mom, are you there?" Carter asked, and his voice had that uncomfortable edge like when he was a teenager and got caught sneaking out. But this was worse because he wasn't a child anymore. He was 32 years old and choosing to exclude me from the most important day of his life. "I'm here." I managed to say, though my voice came out like sandpaper scraping wood. "We'll send you pictures," he offered, like that was some kind of consolation prize, like seeing my only child get married through someone else's Instagram posts could ever replace being there to fix his tie or cry happy tears or dance with him to that song we used to sing when he had nightmares. The thing about betrayal is it doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in through the people you trust most, wearing the face of someone you die for, and by the time you recognize it for what it is, you're already bleeding out, emotionally speaking. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours just staring at the photo on my refrigerator from Carter's college graduation, where he's hugging me and we're both laughing because some kid behind us had tripped and sent their cap flying, and in that photo, we look like a real family, like people who would never hurt each other like this. The wedding was set for June 15th at 2 in the afternoon at the Riverside Gardens, which I knew because I'd been stalking the venue's social media and saw Brooke's cousin post about it, and yes, I know that's pathetic. But when you're excluded from your child's life, you become a detective of your own family, gathering crumbs of information like a starving person. I spent the next 2 weeks alternating between rage and devastation, like someone had installed a switch in my chest that flipped without warning, making me want to either burn down their apartment or curl up in bed and never get up again. My friend Grace kept telling me to confront them to demand answers, but she didn't understand that when someone decides you're not special enough for their wedding, they've already told you everything you need to know about your value in their life. The worst part was the money situation because for 3 years I'd been hemorrhaging cash to keep them afloat, paying $500 monthly for their rent, another $300 for their car insurance, plus all the emergencies that somehow always happened right when I'd managed to save a little for myself, like when their refrigerator broke, or when Brooke needed dental work, or when they just had to have that new couch for their apartment. I calculated it once in a moment of masochistic curiosity and realized I'd given them $37,000 over 3 years. $37,000 from my retirement fund, from the life insurance money I got when my husband Paul died, from the savings I'd scraped together working as a nurse for 40 years. But money wasn't even the real loss because I would have given them everything I had if they'd just treated me like family, like I mattered, like I was more than an ATM with emotions that inconveniently wanted to be part of their lives. June 15th came like a scheduled execution, and I spent the day doing normal things, like they were acts of rebellion. I went grocery shopping. I cleaned my bathroom. I repotted the orchid that had been dying on my windowsill, and I absolutely did not drive past Riverside Gardens at 2:30 in the afternoon, and I definitely didn't see the photographer taking pictures of the wedding party, where Brooke's parents stood proudly next to the happy couple. That night, I drank an entire bottle of wine and looked through Carter's baby photos, remembering how he used to call me his best friend, how he'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, how he promised he'd take care of me when I got old, how he said I'd be the best grandmother in the world to his children, if he ever had them. The call came exactly 1 week after the wedding on a Saturday morning when I was planting tomatoes in my backyard, trying to find some kind of peace in the simple act of creating life from seeds and soil and water. My phone rang with Brooke's number, which was unusual because she never called me directly. It was always Carter who played the intermediary in our awkward relationship, but when I answered, her voice was different, desperate, almost panicked, like someone had pulled the ground out from under her designer heels. "Margaret, we have a situation," she said, and I noticed she used my actual name instead of the condescending Maggie she usually threw around like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. "The landlord is threatening eviction, we're behind on rent, and we need $2,500 by Monday. Or we're out on the street, and I know you usually handle the rent, but this month it didn't come through, and we assumed you'd send it like always, but you didn't, and now we're in serious trouble." The audacity of her words hit me like ice water in the face, because not only had they excluded me from their wedding, but they'd still expected me to keep paying their bills like some kind of invisible benefactor who existed only to fund their lifestyle. "That's unfortunate," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking with rage, or maybe it was satisfaction because finally, I had power in this relationship. "Margaret, please," Brooke continued, and I could hear the edge of tears in her voice, which might have moved me once, but now just sounded like manipulation. "We just spent everything on the wedding. You know how expensive these things are. The venue, the flowers, the photographer. We're completely tapped out, and Carter's new job doesn't start until next month." "The wedding," I repeated slowly, like I was tasting the word for the first time. "The one I wasn't invited to because I'm not special enough that wedding." The silence on the other end was deafening, and for a moment I thought she'd hung up, but then I heard her breathing getting faster, like she was trying to control her temper, or maybe her panic. That was Carter's decision. She lied smoothly, but I knew better, because I'd heard her whispering that day. I'd heard her poison dripping into my son's ear. "Well, Brooke," I said, standing up from my garden and brushing the dirt off my knees, feeling oddly calm, like I'd been preparing for this moment my whole life. "I've recently made a decision, too. I only help special people now, and since I'm not special enough for your wedding, I'm certainly not special enough to pay your rent." She started sputtering excuses and accusations, saying I was being petty and vindictive, that I was ruining their lives over a misunderstanding, but I just walked back into my house and looked at my bank statement, where for the first time in 3 years the balance was growing instead of shrinking. Carter called an hour later, and his voice had that little boy quality it got when he wanted something, when he used to beg for a new video game or to stay up past bedtime, except now he was begging for money to keep a roof over his head. "Mom, please," he said, "you know, we love you." The wedding thing was just, Brooke wanted something small and intimate, and I couldn't say no to her on her special day, you understand, right? You were married once, you know how brides get. The manipulation was so obvious it was almost insulting, like he thought I was too stupid or too desperate for his love to see through it. But what he didn't understand was that something had broken in me when they excluded me from that wedding. Something fundamental had shifted, and I wasn't the same woman who would have emptied her bank account for a crumb of their attention. Carter, I said, I've supported you for 3 years. I've paid your rent, your insurance, your emergencies. I've given you $37,000. And in return, you and Brooke decided I wasn't special enough to watch you get married, so no, I don't understand, and I won't be sending any more money. He tried everything. Guilt-anger appeals to family loyalty, even bringing up his dead father, saying Dad would be disappointed in me for abandoning his son. But that was his biggest mistake, because Paul would have been appalled at how Carter treated me. Paul, who wrote me love letters until the day he died. Paul, who called me his Queen Paul, who would have never let anyone disrespect me the way our son had. The next few days were a symphony of phone calls and texts from Carter and Brooke, and even Brooke's parents, who suddenly remembered I existed now that their daughter's housing situation was in jeopardy. They all had different tactics. Brooke's mother tried to shame me, saying a real mother would never let her child be homeless. Brooke's father offered to mediate, suggesting we all sit down and talk like adults. Carter sent me photos from his childhood, with captions like, "Remember when you said you'd always be there for me?" And Brooke just kept calling and calling until I finally blocked her number. But the one that almost broke me was when Carter showed up at my door on Sunday evening, looking exhausted and defeated, wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in at the coffee shop 3 days earlier, when I'd accidentally run into him and he'd pretended not to see me until I said his name. "Mom," he said, standing on my porch like a stranger, because that's what we'd become, strangers who shared DNA and history, but not respect or genuine love. "Can I come in just to talk no money stuff? I promise I just miss you." And I wanted to scream, because where was this missing me when he was planning his wedding? Where was this need for my presence when he was saying I do, when he was cutting the cake, when he was dancing with his new wife? I let him in because I'm weak when it comes to him, because even though he'd broken my heart, he was still my baby boy, and some stupid part of me hoped maybe he'd come to apologize. Really apologize, not just manipulate me for money. We sat in the living room where his high school graduation photos still hung on the wall, where his father's chair still sat empty after all these years, where we used to have movie nights before Brooke came along and slowly poisoned him against me. I made coffee while Carter sat on the couch, looking around my living room like he'd never seen it before. Even though he'd grown up in this house, learned to walk on these floors, broke that lamp playing indoor baseball when he was 10. His hands were shaking slightly, and I wondered if it was from stress or withdrawal from the comfortable life I'd been funding. But I didn't ask, because I was tired of always being the one who asked who cared, who tried to bridge the gap between us. "Mom, I messed up," he said finally, and for a second, my heart jumped, thinking this was it, the apology I'd been waiting for the moment he'd realize what he'd done. The wedding, it got out of hand. Brooke's family had all these demands and expectations, and before I knew it, the guest list was set, and you weren't on it, and I should have fought harder, but I didn't want to start our marriage with a fight. "So you started it by breaking your mother's heart instead," I said, setting his coffee down harder than necessary, making it slosh over the rim onto my grandmother's lace doily. That seemed like a better foundation for a marriage, excluding the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything for you, who loved you more than life itself. He flinched, but continued his rehearsed speech, because I could tell it was rehearsed, probably coached by Brooke, who was likely sitting in their car outside waiting for him to secure the money. "I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be, but Mom, we're about to be homeless, actually homeless, and I know you don't owe us anything, but I'm begging you, just this one last time, help us, and I promise things will be different." "Different?" how I asked, leaning back in my chair, studying his face, looking for any sign of the sweet boy who used to leave me drawings under my pillow, with messages like, "I love you, Mom," written in crayon. Will I suddenly become special enough for family events? Will Brooke stop rolling her eyes when I speak? Will you start calling me for reasons other than money? Will I get to be a grandmother who actually sees her grandchildren if you have them? Or will I just be the checkbook you remember when bills are due? The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap, and I could see him struggling between his pride and his desperation, between the story he'd told himself about our relationship and the reality I was forcing him to face. "We'll include you more," he offered weakly. But we both knew it was a lie, because inclusion isn't something you schedule like a dental appointment. It's something that comes naturally when you actually want someone in your life. Carter. I stood up, signaling this conversation was over. You made a choice when you excluded me from your wedding. You chose Brooke's comfort over your mother's presence. You chose her family over yours. You chose to treat me like I was disposable, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice. "But we'll be homeless," he said again, like repetition would change my mind, like the magic word homeless would unlock my wallet the way it had so many times before. "No," I corrected him. "You'll have to find a smaller apartment, or move in with Brooke's parents, who were special enough for your wedding, or get second jobs, or sell that expensive furniture I bought you, or figure it out like actual adults do when they can't rely on someone else's money." He stood up too, and for a moment I thought he might cry, but instead his face hardened in a way that reminded me of Brooke's influence, of the way she'd taught him to see me as an obligation rather than a mother. "Fine," he said, heading for the door, his shoulders rigid with anger or maybe embarrassment. "When you're old and alone, don't come crying to me about how your son never visits, because you're making that choice right now. You're choosing money over family." I almost laughed at the irony of him accusing me of choosing money over family, when he'd literally put a price tag on our relationship for 3 years, treating me like a bank account with inconvenient emotions. "No, Carter. I'm choosing self-respect over exploitation. I'm choosing dignity over manipulation. I'm choosing to stop enabling two adults who think love is measured in dollars rather than presence." He slammed the door when he left, rattling the pictures on the wall, including the one of us at his college graduation. The one where we looked happy, where we looked like a real family, where I still believed I mattered to him beyond my checking account balance. That night, I sat in Paul's chair for the first time since he died 13 years ago, and I talked to him, or maybe to myself, or maybe to the ghost of the mother I used to be, before I confused love with money, before I believed I had to buy my place in my son's life. I told him about the wedding, about the exclusion, about the money, about how our sweet boy had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who could look me in the eye and lie, someone who could take and take and take, while giving nothing back, not even basic respect. Monday came and went, and I knew they'd been evicted because Brooke's mother called me screaming about how I'd ruined their lives, how I was a terrible mother, how karma would get me for this, but I just hung up because I was done absorbing everyone else's anger about consequences they'd created. They moved in with Brooke's parents, which must have been humiliating for them considering how Brooke always bragged about their independence, their adult life, their success, which had all been funded by me. Carter texted me a photo of him sleeping on a pull-out couch with the caption, "Hope you're happy." But what he didn't understand was that I wasn't happy or unhappy. I was just done. I was empty of the desperate need for his approval that had driven me to bankruptcy, both financial and emotional. 2 months passed without contact, and I started to rebuild my life in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I joined a book club where no one knew about Carter, where I was just Margaret who made excellent banana bread and had insightful comments about character development. I started taking watercolor classes at the community center, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had money for because it was always going to Carter and Brooke's emergencies. I even went on a date with Arthur from my grief support group And while it didn't lead anywhere romantic, it reminded me that I was still a person worthy of interest and respect. The money I saved by not paying their rent started accumulating in my account, and for the first time in years, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't checking my balance with anxiety. I wasn't calculating how much I could give them while still being able to eat. I bought myself a new dress, not for any special occasion, but just because it was beautiful, and I deserved beautiful things. I replaced my 15-year-old television that had been held together with duct tape because Carter always needed the money more. I even booked a cruise to Alaska, something Paul and I had always planned to do, but never got the chance. And while the thought of going alone scared me, it also thrilled me in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then one Thursday afternoon, while I was painting a terrible landscape that looked more like abstract art gone wrong, my doorbell rang. The security camera I'd installed after Carter's last visit showed me Brooke standing there alone holding something in her hands, looking smaller, somehow diminished, like the confidence that usually radiated from her had been switched off. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won, and I opened the door to find her holding a wedding album of all things, her face puffy from crying, her usually perfect makeup streaked and smudged. "Can I come in?" she asked, and her voice was so different from the entitled tone I was used to that I stepped aside without thinking, letting her into my home, where she'd only been a handful of times, always reluctantly, always checking her phone for an escape route. She sat on my couch and opened the album to a page of family photos where Brooke's parents and siblings surrounded the happy couple, and there in the corner, barely visible, was an empty chair with a small reserved sign that I had to squint to read. But when I did, my blood turned cold because it said Mom's seat, and I realized they'd reserved a place for Brooke's deceased mother, but not for me, the living mother who was actively excluded. I found this when we were packing. Brooke said, her voice hollow, and I realized how cruel this must look. But I need you to know this wasn't my idea. The empty chair, the sign that was my mother's doing. She thought it would be touching, but looking at it now, seeing it next to all the photos where you should have been, I realize how monstrous we were. The admission should have felt like vindication, but instead, it just felt tired, like a wound that had already scarred over being picked at for no good reason. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Not sitting down, not offering her coffee, not pretending this was a social visit when we both knew it was something else. "Because I'm pregnant?" she said, and the words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned everything down. 3 months along, and my parents are losing their minds because we're living in their basement. Carter can't find a job that pays enough for us to move out, and I'm scared. Margaret, I'm really scared that our baby is going to grow up in that toxic house where my father drinks and my mother criticizes everything, and we'll never be able to give them a proper life. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a knife, because here she was asking for help from the woman she deemed not special enough for their lives, but apparently special enough to fund their child's future. "Congratulations," I said flatly, because what else was there to say when your son's wife, who had orchestrated your exclusion from their wedding, was now sitting in your living room playing the pregnancy card like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Please don't be like that," she said, tears starting fresh down her cheeks. "I know we hurt you. I know we were horrible. But this baby, your grandchild, deserves better than what we can give them right now, and you're the only person who can help us get back on our feet." My grandchild. I repeated the words, tasting bitter and sweet at the same time, because yes, this would be my grandchild. But what kind of relationship would I have with a child whose parents had already shown me exactly how little I meant to them? Tell me, Brooke, will I be special enough to meet this baby? Or will that privilege be reserved for your family? Will I be allowed to hold them? Or will that be too much inclusion for someone of my low status? Will you tell them about me? Or will I be the grandmother who exists only when rent is due? She flinched at each question, but didn't deny the accusations because we both knew they were based on established patterns, on 3 years of behavior that had culminated in my exclusion from their wedding. Things would be different, she whispered. But even she didn't sound convinced because how could things be different when the fundamental problem was that neither she nor Carter actually wanted me in their lives? They just wanted my money. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the garden where I'd been planting tomatoes the day she called, asking for rent money, the day I'd finally found my backbone after 3 years of being bent and broken. Brooke, do you know what I did with the money I saved by not paying your rent for the past 2 months? I asked, not turning around because I didn't want to see her face when she realized this well was permanently dry. I joined a book club, bought new clothes, took art classes, booked a cruise to Alaska, all the things I couldn't do when I was funding your life. And you know what the most expensive thing I bought was? Do you want to guess what cost me the most money? She didn't answer, so I turned around and looked her straight in the eye. Self-respect, Brooke, that's what I bought with that money. I bought back my self-respect, and it turns out that's priceless. So no, I won't be paying your rent or buying you a house or setting up a college fund or doing any of the things you're about to ask, because I've learned that when you have to pay for love, it's not love at all. It's just a transaction, and I'm done being your ATM. She stood up, clutching the wedding album like a shield, and I could see her calculating whether tears or anger would be more effective. But before she could decide, I opened my door, making it clear this conversation was over. Tell Carter about the baby, I said as she walked past me. Tell him he's going to be a father, and maybe that will finally make him grow up. Maybe having someone depend on him completely will teach him what it means to truly be needed, not for money, but for love, for presence, for all the things that actually matter. She stopped at the threshold and turned back one last time. We named you in our will as the guardian. If something happens to us, she said, like this was some kind of gift, some honor I should be grateful for. The guardian for the grandchild. I'm not special enough to have a relationship with, I asked, and the absurdity of it made me actually laugh. Not a bitter laugh, but a genuine one, because the delusion was so complete, so perfect in its narcissism. Brooke, I wouldn't take guardianship of a child whose parents had already taught them. I was worthless, except for my money that would be cruel to both me and the child. So you might want to update that. We'll maybe ask someone special enough to be at your wedding. She left without another word, and I closed the door, feeling lighter somehow, like I'd just passed a test I didn't know I was taking. That night, I called my sister Helen in Oregon, whom I hadn't spoken to in years because I'd been too ashamed to admit how Carter treated me, how I'd been paying for his life while he pushed me out of it. Helen listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I was done, she said something that changed my perspective entirely. Margaret, she said, you didn't lose a son. You never had the son you thought you did. You had a fantasy of who Carter could be, and you kept paying to keep that fantasy alive. But the real Carter, the one who exists outside your imagination, showed you who he was when he excluded you from his wedding, and people always show you who they are if you're willing to see it. She was right, of course, because the signs had been there for years, the forgotten birthdays, the unreturned calls, the visits that only happened when they needed something, the way Carter never defended me when Brooke was rude, the way he always had an emergency right before holidays, so he couldn't come home. The fantasy son, the one who loved me, who valued me, who saw me as more than a wallet, that son had never existed except in my desperate imagination, and I'd spent $37,000 trying to keep that illusion alive. A week later, I got a letter from Carter, not a text or email, but an actual letter written in his messy handwriting that I'd recognize anywhere from years of school permission slips and Mother's Day cards that stopped coming when he met Brooke. Mom, it began, and I could tell he'd struggled with even that simple word, because the paper was indented, like he'd pressed too hard, trying to make it look sincere. I heard Brooke came to see you, and I want you to know that wasn't my idea. I didn't send her, and I'm sorry she used the pregnancy to try to manipulate you. We both know you've done enough for us, more than enough, and we have no right to ask for more. I'm writing to tell you that we're moving to Phoenix, where Brooke's uncle offered me a job, and we won't be bothering you anymore. I know I destroyed our relationship, and I have to live with that, but I wanted you to know that despite everything I did, love you, I just loved myself more, and that's something I'm going to have to work on before I become a father. Because I don't want my child to feel about me the way I've made you feel about yourself, worthless unless you're useful. The letter should have made me cry, but I'd run out of tears for Carter sometime between his wedding and this moment. So instead, I just filed it away with his baby photos and report cards and all the other artifacts of a relationship that had died long before I'd admitted it to myself. Phoenix was perfect, far enough away that I wouldn't run into them at the grocery store, wouldn't have to see Brooke's pregnant belly growing with a grandchild. I'd never know, wouldn't have to pretend everything was fine when people asked about Carter, because distance made lying easier. I filled my days with new activities, new friends, new purposes that had nothing to do with being Carter's mother or anyone's bank account. I volunteered at the Literacy Center teaching adults to read and found more fulfillment in watching a 60-year-old man read his first complete sentence than I'd ever found in funding Carter's lifestyle. I joined a hiking group and discovered muscles I'd forgotten I had, lungs that could do more than sigh in disappointment, legs that could carry me up mountains instead of just to the bank to make transfers. The cruise to Alaska happened in September, and I stood on the deck watching glaciers calve into the sea, massive chunks of ice that had been part of something bigger for millennia, suddenly breaking away and floating off on their own journey. The metaphor wasn't lost on me, but instead of sadness, I felt recognition, like the universe was showing me that sometimes breaking away was natural, necessary, even beautiful in its own violent way. I met a woman named Dorothy on that cruise, whose daughter had done something similar, excluded her from family events while taking her money, and we spent evenings drinking wine and laughing about how we'd been such fools for so long. "But we're free now," Dorothy said one night as we watched the northern lights paint the sky in impossible colors. "Free to be ourselves instead of just somebody's mother, somebody's wallet, somebody's last resort. And that freedom is worth more than all the family dinners. We'll miss all the grandchildren. We won't know all the love we thought we were buying, but we're really just renting." When I got home, there was a package on my doorstep with a Phoenix postmark, and inside was a baby photo ultrasound reel with a sticky note that said, "It's a boy and nothing else, no name, no due date, no request, just an acknowledgement that this child existed and I was biologically connected to them." I put the ultrasound on my refrigerator next to the photo from Carter's graduation, because biology doesn't stop existing, just because relationships do. But I didn't feel the pull. I'd expected the desperate need to be involved, because how can you miss something you've never been allowed to have? November came with its Thanksgiving complications, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't cook a turkey, didn't set a place for Carter, didn't pretend everything was fine when he called at the last minute to cancel. Instead, I went to Helen's in Oregon, where her children and grandchildren actually wanted me there, where I was Aunt Margaret, who told funny stories about being a nurse who brought homemade pie, who was included in family photos, because I was actually family, not just a funding source. Helen's son asked me about Carter, and I told him the truth, that we were estranged, that he'd made choices I couldn't support, and I'd made choices he couldn't accept, and that sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who people are and who you need them to be. He looked at me with such sympathy, but also respect, and said, "Aunt Margaret, that must have been the hardest thing you've ever done, cutting him off." And I realized that people understood more than I'd thought they would, that choosing yourself over toxic relationships was seen as strength, not selfishness. Christmas was harder, because every commercial showed happy families, and I couldn't help but wonder if Carter was decorating a tree in Phoenix, if Brooke was hanging stockings for their unborn son, if they ever thought about the Christmas mornings in this house when Carter was young and believed in magic. But then Dorothy called from Seattle, where she'd moved to be closer to her son, who actually valued her, and we talked for 3 hours about everything except our estranged children, and I realized I was building a new kind of family, one based on choice, not chance, on mutual respect, not manipulation. January brought news through the family grapevine that Carter's son had been born, named Paul, after my late husband, which felt like either an olive branch or a cruel joke. I couldn't decide which. There was no birth announcement, no phone call, no request for me to visit, just silence, and the knowledge that somewhere in Phoenix, a baby with my DNA was taking his first breaths, and I wasn't there to witness it. Part of me wanted to get on a plane to show up at their door with baby gifts and apologies and promises to never mention the wedding or the money or the hurt. But I knew that would just reset the cycle. They'd take my gifts, take my money, take my presents when convenient, and then push me aside again when Brooke decided I wasn't special enough for whatever came next. So I stayed in my life, the one I'd built without them, where I was. Margaret, not just Carter's mom, where I had value beyond my bank account, where people invited me places because they wanted me there, not because they needed something. I took up pottery and made lopsided bowls that no one needed, but that brought me joy in their imperfection. I adopted a cat named Winston, who had been at the shelter for 2 years because he was old and cranky and nobody wanted him, but we understood each other perfectly. February brought another letter from Carter, this time with a photo of baby Paul and a longer message. Mom, I know you don't want to hear from me, and I respect that. But I wanted you to know that Paul exists, that he's healthy, that he has your eyes and Dad's nose, and that sometimes when he sleeps, he makes this face that reminds me of you when you're concentrating on something difficult. Brooke and I are trying to make it work, and the job in Phoenix is going well enough that we can afford a small apartment, and we're not asking for anything. Not money, not forgiveness, not even a response. Just wanted you to know that part of you continues in him, even if we've broken everything else. I kept the photo but didn't respond, because what would I say that wouldn't sound like either forgiveness they hadn't earned or bitterness that would only poison me further? Instead, I framed it and put it in a drawer with all the other complicated memories, the things that hurt too much to display, but meant too much to throw away. March brought spring, and with it a sense of renewal that felt earned rather than forced. I planted a new garden this time with flowers instead of vegetables, because I wanted beauty for its own sake, not something practical or nourishing, just something that existed to bring joy. The tomatoes I'd been planting when Brooke called that first time had never grown properly, like they knew they were planted in anger and refused to thrive. But these flowers bloomed like they were grateful for my attention. Grace, my friend, who'd watched this whole saga unfold, asked me if I ever regretted cutting them off, and I had to think about it. Really consider whether the freedom I'd gained was worth the family I'd lost. But the truth was, I hadn't lost a family. I'd lost the illusion of one. I'd lost the exhausting pretense that money could buy love, that sacrifice could earn respect, that being useful was the same as being valued. What I'd gained was so much more: my dignity, my financial security, my sense of self, my peace, my ability to sleep without wondering what emergency would drain my account next. April came with its rain and renewal, and I got a job part-time at a local florist because I'd discovered I loved working with flowers, loved creating arrangements that made people smile, loved being useful in a way that was appreciated rather than expected. The owner, a woman named Rose, who was 15 years younger than me, treated me with more respect than Carter had shown me in years, asking my opinion, valuing my experience, including me in decisions about the shop. One day, a young woman came in crying, needing flowers for her mother's funeral, and she couldn't afford much. so I quietly paid the difference and helped her create something beautiful. She hugged me and called me an angel, and I realized that this was what generosity was supposed to feel like: freely given, without expectation, without manipulation, just human kindness flowing from one person to another. May arrived with its promise of summer, and I decided to sell the house, the one where Carter had grown up, where Paul had died, where I'd spent so many years waiting for phone calls that only came when bills were due. It was too big for just me and Winston, too full of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, too rooted in a past that no longer served me. The real estate agent said the market was perfect, and I could get enough to buy a smaller place and have plenty left over for the retirement I'd almost destroyed funding other people's lives. As I packed up Carter's room, I found the cards he'd made me as a child, proclaiming me the best mom in the world, with crayon hearts and misspelled words of love. I kept them because that child had existed, even if he'd grown into someone I didn't recognize, and those moments of pure love deserved to be remembered, even if they couldn't be reclaimed. The house sold in 2 weeks to a young family with 3 children who ran through the rooms, laughing and planning, and I could see the life that would fill these walls after I left. The mother asked if I was sad to leave, and I told her no, because I was taking everything that mattered with me and leaving behind everything that had hurt me, and houses were just containers for life, not life itself. I bought a small condo near the water with windows that faced the sunset and a balcony where Winston could sun himself and judge the neighbors. It cost half what the house sold for, leaving me with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, without ever having to choose between my needs and someone else's wants. The first night in my new place, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not hope that Carter would change, or that I'd meet my grandson, or that the past could be rewritten, but hope for the future I was creating day by day, choice by choice, boundary by boundary. June 15th came again, 1 year exactly since the wedding I wasn't invited to, and this time I didn't spend it crying or drinking or looking at old photos. Instead, I took myself out for dinner at the fancy restaurant I'd never been able to afford when I was supporting Carter and Brooke. I ordered the expensive wine and the lobster and the chocolate soufflé, and I toasted myself for surviving, for choosing myself, for learning that love without respect is just manipulation with a pretty name. The waiter asked if I was celebrating something special, and I told him yes, I was celebrating my Independence Day, and he didn't need to know that I meant independence from my own son, from the toxic cycle of giving, without receiving, from the prison of believing I had to buy my worth. As I walked home along the water, watching couples and families enjoying the evening, I waited for the pang of loneliness, but it never came because I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Being alone was a choice, a peaceful state where I answered to no one, disappointed, no one failed, no one. Being lonely was what I'd felt sitting at Sunday dinners with Carter and Brooke, being ignored. Being lonely was paying for their presence and still feeling invisible. Being lonely was having a son who only saw me as a resource. Now I had friends who called just to chat, who invited me places because they enjoyed my company, who respected my boundaries and appreciated my presence. I had a life that wasn't defined by my relationship to Carter, wasn't diminished by his absence, wasn't waiting to be validated by his attention. I was complete, not because I'd found someone to fill the void he'd left, but because I'd learned the void was actually space to breathe, to grow, to discover who Margaret was when she wasn't trying to be the perfect mother to an imperfect son. The story could end here with me finding peace in my new life, learning to live without the family I'd thought I needed, discovering that freedom was worth more than toxic connection. But life doesn't really end, it just keeps going, adding chapters we don't expect. So when my phone rang on a Tuesday morning in July and I saw Carter's number, I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won, and I picked up to hear not his voice, but a woman's voice, official and frightening, saying, "Mrs. Richardson, this is Phoenix General Hospital. Your son and daughter-in-law have been in an accident, and you're listed as their emergency contact." The world stopped, or maybe I stopped while the world continued spinning, and I heard myself asking questions about conditions and prognosis, and visiting hours, while my mind tried to process how I could be the emergency contact for people who hadn't spoken to me in months. They were stable, the nurse said, but serious, and there was a baby who needed someone, and suddenly I was booking a flight to Phoenix. Not because I forgave them, not because the past was erased, but because sometimes life demands we show up regardless of the hurt. The hospital smelled like every hospital I'd worked in for 40 years, that mixture of disinfectant and despair, hope and grief, all mingled in recycled air. I found Carter first unconscious, but breathing tubes and wires, making him look fragile in a way I hadn't seen since he was born, premature and fighting. The nurse said he'd been driving when a drunk driver hit them head-on, that Brooke was in surgery, that the baby had been in the car, but was miraculously unharmed, just scared and hungry and needing someone. I sat by Carter's bed, not holding his hand, not crying, not praying, just observing this stranger who was my son, this man who'd chosen money over mother-wife, over family pride, over connection. He looked older than his 33 years, stressed and tired, even in unconsciousness, and I wondered if Phoenix had been the fresh start they'd hoped for, or just the same problems in a new location. When he woke up hours later, the first thing he saw was me, and the look on his face was something I'll never forget. Equal parts relief and shame, hope and fear, recognition and disbelief. "Mom," he whispered, and the word carried so much weight, it seemed to exhaust him just saying it. "I'm here," I said, not, "It's okay," or "I forgive you," or "I love you," just the simple truth that I was present in this moment, regardless of all the moments I'd been excluded from. "Paul," he said next, and I knew he meant the baby, not his father. "He's fine," I assured him. "The nurses have him, he's safe. He's being cared for," and I saw tears slide down his face, whether from relief or pain or the simple, overwhelming reality of almost losing everything. Brooke came out of surgery successfully, but wouldn't wake up for another day, and in that space between crisis and resolution, Carter and I existed in a strange limbo where the past was suspended and only the present mattered. He told me about Phoenix, about the job that barely covered expenses, about Brooke's postpartum depression, about the fights about money, about how they'd been driving to a marriage counselor when the accident happened. I didn't offer money or solutions or judgment, just listened to this story of two people who'd thought cutting me off would solve their problems, only to discover their problems had nothing to do with me. When Brooke woke up, the first thing she asked for was Paul, and the second thing she asked was whether I was really there or if she was hallucinating from the medication. When I confirmed I was real, she started crying, not the manipulative tears I'd seen before, but genuine, exhausted tears of someone who'd been holding too much for too long. They released them 3 days later with instructions and medications and appointments, and the assumption that I'd be taking them home, caring for them, helping them recover. But I'd booked a hotel room because boundaries don't disappear just because crisis appears, and I wasn't ready to pretend the past year hadn't happened. "We need to talk," I said once they were settled in their small apartment that smelled like sour milk and desperation. "About what happens now, about what we are to each other, about what I can and cannot do. Because I won't go back to the way things were. I can't." Carter looked at Brooke, and she looked at the baby, and I looked at all three of them, this family I was connected to by blood and history, but not by choice or respect. "We don't expect anything," Brooke said finally. "We know we burned that bridge, set it on fire, and danced while it collapsed, so we're not asking for money or babysitting or anything really. We just needed someone to pick us up from the hospital, and you were the only one who came. The only one I thought about, that the uncle with the job, the parents they'd lived with, the friends from the wedding, all the special people who'd been invited to celebrate with them, but weren't there for the aftermath. Maybe that's what family really was. Not the people you party with, but the people who show up at hospitals, who answer emergency calls, who come even when they shouldn't have to. I met my grandson that day, really met him, not just saw him, and he did have my eyes and Paul's nose, and something in his expression that reminded me of Carter, before life complicated everything. I held him for exactly 5 minutes, feeling the weight of potential and possibility, before handing him back, because I wasn't ready for more, wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for more. Before I left, I gave them an envelope with $1,000, not $37,000, not ongoing support, just enough to help with immediate needs because I wasn't heartless, just careful. Carter started to protest, but I stopped him with a look that said this was not negotiable. This was not the beginning of something. This was just human kindness, nothing more. I flew home that evening, and when people asked about my trip, I said it was to help with a medical emergency, which was true without being revealing. Dorothy asked if I'd seen Carter, and I told her yes, but that seeing someone and reconnecting with them were different things, and I was still choosing the distance that protected my peace. August brought a text from Carter, just a photo of Paul, taking his first steps, and the words, "Thought you should know," with no request, no manipulation, just information shared. I saved the photo but didn't respond, because what was there to say that wouldn't open doors I'd fought so hard to close? September arrived with my second Alaska cruise, this time alone by choice, and I stood on the same deck, watching the same glaciers, but feeling completely different. Last year, I'd been broken, and rebuilding this year, I was whole, and choosing my wholeness over the chaos of reconnection. The northern lights seemed brighter, or maybe I was just better at seeing beauty now that I wasn't clouded by anger and hurt. October brought another letter from Carter, longer than the others, more honest than anything he'd written before. "Mom, I've been in therapy since the accident, and I'm learning things about myself I don't like. I'm learning that I used you not just financially, but emotionally, taking while giving nothing back. I'm learning that Brooke and I enabled each other's worst qualities, our selfishness, our entitlement, our inability to see you as a person rather than a resource. I'm learning that being a father means thinking beyond yourself, and I'm ashamed that I never thought beyond myself when it came to you. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation or anything really. I just wanted you to know that I see it now, what I did, who I was, who I'm trying not to be anymore. I'm working 2 jobs now to support my family without help, and it's harder than I ever imagined, but it's also honest in a way my life never was when you were paying for it. Paul deserves better than the father I've been so far, and you deserved better than the son I was. This letter I kept not in the drawer with the painful memories, but on my dresser where I could see it daily. Not as hope for reconciliation, but as evidence that people could grow, could change, could become better, even if it was too late to repair what they'd broken. November came again with its Thanksgiving questions, and this time, when Helen asked about Carter, I told her he was working on himself, that he had a son, that we were not in contact, but I wished him well, from a distance. Her family embraced me again, and I realized this was what chosen family felt like, people who included you because they wanted to, not because they needed something. December brought a Christmas card from Phoenix with a photo of their small family and a simple message wishing you peace, and I appreciated the restraint, the lack of manipulation, the simple acknowledgement that I existed without asking for anything in return. I sent nothing back because sometimes silence is the most honest response. As the year ended, I reflected on the journey from that horrible phone call about the wedding to this moment of hard-won peace. I had lost a son, but found myself lost a family, but gained freedom, lost the illusion of love, but discovered the reality of self-respect. Some people might say I was bitter or unforgiving, but I knew the truth. I was protective of the life I'd built without them, the peace I'd found in their absence, the person I'd become when I stopped trying to buy their love. The new year began with news that Carter and Brooke were having another baby, and I felt nothing, not joy, not sorrow, not the pull to be involved, just a neutral acknowledgement that life continues whether we're part of it or not. Dorothy asked if I regretted not reconciling, and I told her reconciliation required both parties to want it, and I didn't want to return to any version of what we'd been before. She understood because she'd made the same choice with her daughter, choosing peace over toxic connection, choosing self-respect over family dysfunction, choosing to love from a distance rather than be destroyed up close. My life continued full and rich without them. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to see but couldn't afford when I was funding their lives. I made friends who valued me for who I was not, what I could provide. I volunteered and worked and created and lived fully without the constant drain of their needs and dramas. Sometimes I wondered about Paul, about the grandfather he'd never know, the grandmother who existed only in photos and stories. But I also knew that my absence was better than my presence would have been if it came with resentment and pain, better an absent grandmother than a bitter one, better no relationship than a toxic one. The truth about family is that blood doesn't make you special, and sharing DNA doesn't guarantee love or respect or kindness. The truth about money is that when you have to pay for someone's presence, you're not buying love, you're renting attention. The truth about self-respect is that once you find it, you can't trade it for anything, not even the possibility of reconciliation with people who should have loved you better. So this is where the story ends, not with a happy reunion or forgiveness or the restoration of family bonds, but with something more honest, more real, more valuable. It ends with me choosing myself every single day, choosing peace over drama, choosing dignity over desperation, choosing to love people who love me back rather than chasing those who only see my worth in dollars. It ends with the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to stay away, to break the cycle, to refuse to participate in dysfunction, even when that dysfunction calls itself family. It ends with me whole and complete and free, living a life that belongs fully to me. Some might call this a sad ending, but I call it a realistic one because not all families reconcile, not all wounds heal, not all relationships deserve resurrection. Sometimes the best ending is the one where you save yourself, where you choose your own peace, where you recognize that love without respect is just manipulation with a prettier name, and refuse to accept it anymore. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you had to buy someone's love, if you've ever been excluded from important moments while being expected to pay for them, if you've ever confused being useful with being valued, I want you to know that you deserve better. You deserve to be special enough without paying for it. You deserve to be invited to the wedding and the birthday and the random Tuesday dinner. You deserve to be more than an emergency contact or a financial backup plan. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not what you provide. And sometimes the only way to get what you deserve is to walk away from people who will never give it to you, even if those people share your blood, even if you raised them, even if walking away breaks your heart, because a broken heart can heal, but a broken spirit from years of being used and dismissed, that's harder to recover from. So choose yourself. Choose peace. Choose relationships that don't require payment. Choose to be around people who see you as special, without conditions, without transactions, without the constant calculation of what you can do for them. Choose freedom even if it looks like loneliness at first, because being alone and whole is better than being surrounded and empty. That's the real lesson of this story, not that family always fails or that children always disappoint, but that you have the power to decide what you'll accept. You have the right to set boundaries, even with blood relatives, especially with blood relatives who use that blood as leverage. You have the permission to stop funding other people's lives at the expense of your own. You have the freedom to walk away from anyone who makes you feel like you're not special enough, while simultaneously expecting you to make their life special. Before I end this story, let me know in the comments if you've ever had to choose between family and self-respect, between being needed and being valued, between giving everything and keeping something for yourself. Share your stories, because sometimes knowing we're not alone in these impossible choices makes them feel a little less impossible. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships and boundaries, please like and subscribe, because these stories need to be told. Too many of us suffer in silence, thinking we're bad parents or bad people for refusing to be used, and it's time we recognized that choosing ourselves isn't selfish, it's necessary. Remember, you are special enough exactly as you are, without paying for it, without earning it, without constantly proving it to people who should already know. You are worthy of love that doesn't come with a price tag of respect, that doesn't require transactions of inclusion, that doesn't depend on your usefulness. Choose accordingly and never apologize for protecting your peace. Thank you for listening to my story. And until next time, remember that sometimes the best family is the one you choose, and the best life is the one you build after walking away from people who only saw you as a resource. Take care of yourselves and each other. But most importantly, take care of yourself first, because you can't pour from an empty cup, and you can't buy love that was never for sale.